In the beginning, before the creation of the world, there was only the great being Ruggier Zacherel. Ruggier Zacherel was everything and all there was, but since there was only Ruggier Zacherel, the great being was bored and fell asleep. As Ruggier Zacherel fell asleep, the great being began to dream. As Ruggier Zacherel dreamed, the world was created. Consequently, the world was created on accident and without any manner of plan or purpose. As the great being dreamed, the world amassed like a great tree, sprouting off countless branches, which sprouted off further branches, entangling and enmeshing with one another. Branches of the world decayed and fell away, but the branches that had sprouted off from them kept growing and sprouting off further branches, such that the world moved like a great snake chasing after its tail, but continuing to shed its skin and grow at such an expansive rate that it was never able to reach the end of itself. Within this dreamed world, entities known as humans came to develop complex consciousnesses and societies, and some of their stories came to develop plots, as if they actually had some kind of meaning. In this way, the world developed, diversified, and expanded in ways entirely out of the control of Ruggier Zacherel, who was very tired of everything, and yet could not wake up from it. Chapter 1. Diomedon Todoroki Madubabakar, first son of King Agamengir and Queen Atheris, was the crown prince of the desert kingdom of Ordiuk. He hated it. He was the one who would be inheriting the throne, and the expectations for the kingdom's future were riding on him. He was supposed to be perfect. He was supposed to be the best. He wasn't allowed to make mistakes. He wasn't allowed to do anything that could get him injured. His life was too vital. Everyone bowed down to him and did things for him. He wasn't allowed to do those things for himself. He was supposed to be happy. He wasn't supposed to be bitter or angry. He was supposed to glory in being the heir. He was supposed to like having the power to tell everyone what to do and not to have to do anything for himself. He was supposed to feel honored and superior because of it. He didn't. All he felt was frustrated, constrained, suffocated, and angry beyond belief. Diomedon Todoroki was the crown prince of the kingdom of Ordiuk, and he hated the role with a burning, fiery passion. Nalaki Arkala Madubabakar, second child and only daughter of King Agamengir and Queen Atheris, was the sole princess of the desert kingdom of Ordiuk. She loved it. Everybody waited on her. She got whatever she wanted. She got away with whatever she wanted. She was being groomed to eventually marry an important member of the government or military. The idea was for her to grow up feeling beautiful and to develop an agreeable personality, so everyone was sweet to her. She was spoiled, really. It was great. Her brothers had it a lot harder. She felt bad for them sometimes. Other times she enjoyed messing with them because they couldn't do anything to her. She did love them, though. She was very glad, however, that she'd been born a girl and not a boy. Luxanthus Enkidu Madubabakar, third child of King Agamengir and Queen Atheris, was the second prince of the desert kingdom of Ordiuk. He didn't really think about it. His status and role as the second prince were a fact of his life, and he accepted it. It made sense that the crown prince should focus on academics and the technicalities of running a kingdom while being forbidden from intense physical training that could cause him grievous injury, and it made sense that he himself as the second prince could forego most of the intellectual training and focus on the physical, so someday he could become the kingdom's trusted warrior and war general. Since he wasn't going to become king, he was far more expendable and could afford to get injured and be pushed to his physical limits. Because of that, it also made sense that he must bear the burden of the punishments for his older brother's mistakes. It didn't bother him any. It made sense, and he was good at what he did. When it came to physical feats, he was naturally gifted, far more so than either his older or his younger brother. The brunt of physical burdens, therefore, should fall onto him. He didn't resent either of his brothers for any of it. Rhesicurius Tumra Madubabakar, fourth child of King Agamengir and Queen Ephyris, was the third prince of the desert kingdom of Ordiak. He was always thinking about it. The crown prince, princess, and second prince had been born for strategic purposes, each of them about a year apart. Rhesicurius Tumra had been born 7 years after the second prince, 9 years after the first. His birth had not been for any strategic purpose. King Agamengir and Queen Ephyris, although their marriage had its strategic purposes, deeply loved each other, and Rhesicurius Tumra had simply been the product of a night of passion. His parents and his older siblings loved him, but he felt lost and inadequate. In regard to the kingdom, he did not have a clear role, and he wasn't particularly good at anything. In academics, he was subpar, and when it came to anything physical, he had 2 left feet. He was fully capable of tripping on his own toes when he ran, and giving himself black eyes with his own hands when he flailed. He loved his family, but he didn't know how he fit in it, or what worth he had. Ephyris Rita Madubabakar, queen of Ordiak, considered them her gem children. Her dear Todoroki, with his fiery red-orange eyes like carnelians, and his hair that stuck up like flame and couldn't be tamed. Her dear Arcala, with her deep red eyes like garnets, and her straight hair that she wore down to her shoulders, with her bangs pulled out of her face and braided around her head like a circlet. Her dear Enkidu, with his eyes like gold and his hair that fell down in smooth, effortless waves, even though he never brushed it. Her dear Tumra, with his eyes of 2 different colors, his right eye black like obsidian, and his left a light yellow-orange like amber, and his hair that fell partly down and stuck partially up in obstinate cowlicks, until her daughter one day braided them with metal wire and weighted them down with gold and obsidian beads. What they shared was their warm bronze skin tone, partway between her slightly lighter tone and her husband's slightly darker one. Both Todoroki and Enkidu shared their father's deep, multi-toned brown hair that shifted shades in the light, while Arcala and Tumra shared Ephyris's darker, more single-toned shade. Their particular idiosyncrasies suited them, Ephyris thought. Todoroki with his fiery personality, Arcala with her passionate one, Enkidu with his effortless talent, and Tumra with his alternating boldness and timidity. They were all different, they were all beautiful, and Ephyris loved them all to pieces. Agamengir Naji Madubabakar, king of Ordiak, cared deeply both about his children and about his kingdom. If asked, he would have considered those 2 cares one and the same. If his children flourished, his kingdom would as well. If his kingdom flourished, so would his children. He had great faith in his children. His eldest, although the boy was recalcitrant and had a considerable temper, had already proven himself as being more than worthy of inheriting the throne. His daughter would become an excellent queen that any king would be blessed and fortunate to have by his side. His second son would become a legendary warrior. His youngest, while still a small child, was keenly perceptive and uncannily intuitive, and would make a valuable adviser. King Agamengir had great faith in the future of Ordiak. Diomedon hated everyone. His parents, his siblings, the citizens of Ordiak, the people outside of Ordiak, everyone in the entire world. He hated his father for trying to make him become him. He hated his mother for always misunderstanding his anger and trying to reassure him that he'd make a great king. He hated his sister Nalaki for following him around, not being bothered by his hatred. He hated his brother Loxanthus for always accepting things as they were and not hating him in return. He hated his brother Rhesicurios for being afraid of him. He hated his academic instructors for being hard on him. He hated his fighting instructors for going easy on him. He hated the people of Orduc for being so stupid and sheep-like that they needed a king to lead them. He hated that it had to be him. He hated the people outside of Orduc for making the existence of the kingdom necessary. He hated the deities for making the world the way it was and for forcing him to be the way he was. He hadn't asked to be born the Crown Prince of Orduc. He didn't care about being the Crown Prince of Orduc. He didn't want to be the Crown Prince of Orduc. It was, all of it, absolutely unfair, and it made him so angry. Nalaki loved all her brothers, but she was closest with her elder brother. He was endlessly entertaining, and he made her feel special because she was the only one aside from their mother he allowed to call him Todoroki, while everyone else had to call him Diamandon. Even if he told her not to and didn't call her Arcala in return, he still let her get away with it. He told her that he hated her, and she laughed at him because he didn't mean it and she knew it, so it didn't bother her any. She honestly preferred Todoroki's fiery and unforgiving temper to Enkidu's unflappable placidity or Tumra's fluctuating skittishness. Enkidu was unfailingly considerate, but he was boring as sand. It was easy to get rises out of young Tumra, but he was so sensitive that Nalaki always felt bad for messing with him. She could mess with Todoroki all she wanted, though, and he'd always get amusingly angry at her, and she didn't have to feel bad about it at all, because that was just the way he was. Loxanthus wasn't particularly close with either of his older siblings. He didn't dislike either of them, but he also didn't and couldn't connect with them. They completely baffled him, honestly. It seemed that no matter what he did, Diamandon was always angry with him for something. Loxanthus could never figure out what he'd done wrong. And as far as his sister Nalaki was concerned, Loxanthus had no idea how to interact with her. He couldn't tell what she expected from him. She always seemed disappointed with him for some reason. Outside of royal and social obligations, Loxanthus therefore mostly kept to himself. That only changed once Tumra learned to walk and started following him around everywhere. Loxanthus was almost never alone after that. Tumra tripped over himself to keep up with him, no matter where he went. The younger boy looked up to him, and when Tumra smiled at him like he was the sun, it made Loxanthus feel like he could do anything. Rhesicurios was more than a little frightened of his oldest brother, and his sister intimidated him. Being around them made him anxious. It was the way Diamandon looked at him like he wanted to set him on fire and watch him burn alive, and the way Nalaki smiled at him like she wanted to suck his blood. Diamandon would never have allowed Rhesicurios to call him Todoroki. Nalaki insisted that Rhesicurios call her Arcala, but it always felt weird to do so. Rhesicurios adored his older brother Enkidu, though. Enkidu was kind, and he was strong, and he was good at everything. Rhesicurios felt completely safe whenever he was with him. Enkidu was the best, and Rhesicurios wanted to be just like him. Aetheris could gauge her children's relationships by which names they used with each other. In the Ordrocian culture, individuals' middle names were terms of intimacy and endearment, used only by one's immediate family or the closest and most trusted of friends, while with the rest of society, one's formal first name was used. Her eldest son held a deliberate distance from his siblings by only using their first names and insisting they use his. Her daughter used all their siblings' middle names, even her older brother's, despite his demands that she not. Aetheris' second and third sons used their middle names with each other and their sister, but acquiesced to the eldest's desire for a formal distance, although her youngest son also used his sister's formal name when referring to her outside of her company. Aetheris herself used their middle names when she spoke with them, while her husband used their first names. Agamemnon was the king, and his responsibility to the kingdom had to come first. As the queen, Aetheris had more flexibility and could let herself indulge in motherhood with her children. She could be queen and mother equally, but Agamemnon had to be more king than father. She suspected that it was the reason of his eventual succession to the throne that Todoroki used his siblings' formal names, already anticipating the distance that was necessary for the duties of a king. It made sense to Aetheris, though, that Arkala would insist on using even Todoroki's middle name. The girl was unapologetically brazen and liked getting close to people and up under their skin. Enkidu, for his part, was flexible and could roll with anything, whether formal or intimate, but it made sense that Tumro would feel uncomfortable with his sister, given how sensitive he was. Yet even despite their differences, they seemed to get along with no lasting quarrels, and Aetheris felt herself blessed to have such wonderful, beautiful, gifted children. All of King Agamemnon's children had their flaws. Of course, they all had their merits, too, and their merits and flaws went closely hand in hand. But it was their flaws he had to keep an eye on. Diamandon's temper and overall harsh demeanor, for instance. As king, the boy's strong opinions, vicious self-confidence, and aversion to being influenced by others would be a definite boon. But if he let his anger and unwillingness to listen to advice get the best of him, he could end up making poor decisions out of spite. His violent demeanor could also cost him the trust and loyalty of his subjects, who needed to feel that their king had the best interests of the kingdom and citizens at heart, and would do everything in his power to secure their safety and livelihoods. Nalaki was confrontational and liked to push boundaries. These were not necessarily unfavorable qualities for a woman, especially if she were married strategically to an important member of the government or military whom she could help manipulate for the kingdom's benefit. She and Diamandon were close, and Agamemnon felt assured that this would continue even once she was married and Diamandon was king. But if she were too careless and pushed too far, she could get herself in trouble and take the kingdom down with her. Loxanthus was the least glaringly flawed of Agamemnon's children, probably because his athletic and combative talent shone so brightly it blotted most else out, and because he was so quiet and reserved that it was impossible to tell what he was thinking or feeling. But there was a passivity to his nature that concerned Agamemnon. Certainly, having such a powerful warrior who so readily followed orders would be a blessing to any king, and the boy's self-possessed disposition would be of immeasurable worth in any crisis. Still, Agamemnon worried that, in his determination to carry out his duty no matter the cost, Loxanthus might too quickly accept and devote himself to an unfavorable or even fatalistic course of action, rather than trying to find a better one. It was Rhesycherios who concerned Agamemnon the most. The boy was sensitive and nervous, and despite the clear keenness of his mind, there wasn't anything he was particularly good at. He was astonishingly uncoordinated and clumsy, almost constantly tripping, crashing into things, knocking things over, and driving his fight instructors to their wits' end with his incompetence. According to his academic tutors, he was quick on the uptake, but had great difficulty focusing, and while he seemed to have an uncanny ability to memorize things and recite them by rote, when asked to evaluate material or explain something in his own words, he could barely string together a coherent sentence. It was uncertain what benefit he would be able to bring Orgiak. Fortunately, Rhesycherios was Agamemnon's third son and not necessary for the governing of the kingdom. As king, Agamemnon had a great number of much more pressing concerns. But it was a concern to him nonetheless, both as a father and as a king. All of Agamemnon's children would have to learn to negotiate the world as their royal status dictated, and none of them, not even his youngest, was any exception. Diamandon, despite his incredible temper, had excellent self-control. People really didn't give him enough credit for it. If they'd known how much rage he kept tightly bottled inside, they would have been both terrified and awed. People thought he was angry and lashing out all the time. They hadn't even seen him lashing out. What they'd seen was him keeping his rage carefully, determinedly restrained. What they saw as him being intentionally vitriolic was him trying his hardest not to be. That was how vast his fury was. They should all bless the Daimyo for his incredible self-control. The only times he allowed his anger out were when he was alone in his room. Or at least, mostly alone. Sometimes his sister Nalaki was there. He always shouted at her to leave, but she never did. He would upturn furniture and throw objects at the walls, but never at her. She hadn't asked for any of this either. If you don't want to be the crown prince, Todoroki, it's Diamandon. Then what do you want to be? What would be better than this? She was sitting on his bed, smiling at him and swinging her bare feet. Diamandon glared at her. There was such a fire in his chest, it felt like it was burning him alive from the inside. What I want, he gritted out, is for you to leave me alone. It seems to me, she told him, that nothing would make you happy. The flames within him roared. And why? He asked quietly, with a barely controlled rage that made his entire body shake. Should I want to be happy? He crowded into her space, placing a hand on either side of her legs on the bed, and leaned in, snarling. Why is it so wrong for me to feel so angry? He hated that not only were there all these burdensome expectations about what he was supposed to do, but also all these burdensome expectations about how he was supposed to feel, and he found it terribly ironic that he was being raised to become the king and control the kingdom, when those same people who were raising him to become the king were trying to control him, both from without and from within. Nalaki knew that a lot of people found her older brother scary, but she'd never been frightened of him. She'd always known that he didn't actually hate her, and that he would never hurt her. When Todoroki leaned in close and demanded in desperate, abject fury why it was so wrong for him to feel angry, Nalaki looked back at him with wide eyes for a moment, and then grinned. Well, if you want to be angry, that's okay then, she reassured him, patting him on the cheek before ducking under his arm and skipping across the room. Because that must mean that even if you hate it here, you must like it, since you like that you hate it. And if that's the case, then there's no one else you'd rather be. Which meant that there wasn't anyone he'd rather be than her brother, which made her happy, because she liked having him as her brother. It also meant that he'd always be angry about everything no matter what, and Nalaki found that incredibly reassuring. No matter what might happen in their lives, she'd always be able to count on Todoroki's anger. She thought that, as long as she could count on that, she wouldn't have to worry about anything. He'd been 15 at the time, she 14. They'd already been close, but they only continued to grow closer after that. By the time he was 13, Loxanthus was able to beat most of the warriors in the Ordrokian army one-on-one. His instructors were having difficulty keeping him challenged, so he would be put under grueling physical training and then made to fight while exhausted. He would fight against an ever-increasing number of opponents, with warriors being added to the throng until he finally succumbed. They, of course, did not kill or grievously wound him, but they did make sure that he did not get out unscathed in order that he would understand the consequences of defeat. It was not easy, but neither was it more difficult than he could stand. He simply picked himself up from the sand, made a mental note of his mistakes, and tried again with the intention of being better the next time. He understood that it was only natural that he would make mistakes and be overwhelmed out of inexperience, but he wanted to make sure that he never made the same mistake twice, and that he would develop himself to the point where what used to overwhelm him no longer fazed him. He couldn't do anything about what life threw at him, but he could do a lot about how he handled it, and as long as he could do something, he would. It greatly cheered him when his 6-year-old brother Tumra was waiting at the edge of the training area with a glass of water, a cloth to wipe away his sweat, and a delighted grin beneath his shining, mismatched eyes. "That was so cool, Enkidu!" The young boy was so genuine in his admiration that Loxanthus smiled, taking the water and cloth gratefully and ruffling the boy's messy hair. "Thanks, Tumra." That look on his younger brother's face made his exhaustion more than worth it, and made Loxanthus determined to continue becoming better. Resicurios may have been only 6, and Enkidu may have obviously been a natural talent when it came to fighting and physical feats. But even Resicurios knew that Enkidu's intense training must have started when he'd been around Resicurios' age. And yet, Resicurios' own training was minimal and light. Resicurios couldn't tell if this was because, with how talented Enkidu was, they simply didn't need him as a warrior, or if it was because he was such a natural klutz, being barely able to wield a wooden practice sword without hitting himself in the face, that they'd already given up on him. He knew that he was awkward. His body felt lopsided, and he couldn't wrap his mind around how to force his strangely foreign limbs to perform the actions his instructors demonstrated to him. Surely that was the case for everyone in the beginning and could be trained away, but his instructors looked at him as if they couldn't understand how he could be having such difficulties. Resicurios couldn't understand it either. His academic education was likewise far lighter than Diamendon's, and Resicurios didn't know if that was because, as the third son, he didn't need to be educated about the affairs of state, or if it was because he was so bad at learning, being barely able to focus on anything. He was easily distracted and easily agitated. It was difficult to concentrate on the words on the page in front of him, or the words being spoken to him, when there were so many other sounds assaulting his ears, feeling like physical strikes and scratches. When the chair was uncomfortable and he couldn't figure out how to position his body to make it better. When the light in the room was so painful to his eyes that he fought not to clench them shut. When the dark ink on the pale parchment shifted like shivering sand, quaking as if the words would bury themselves in the grains of the page like scorpions. When there were small bright lights flashing everywhere in his peripheral vision, attracting his attention, and he couldn't stop trying to glance at them. When his instructor's every disappointed look and tone was a crushing blow, leaving his mind in pieces that he had to scramble and collect back up again. Enkidu always picked himself back up, even when he was ground into the dirt. He picked himself up, and there was such an unwavering look of determination in his eyes as he reached again for his weapon in the sand beside him. Enkidu made everything look easy. "Do you think I can be as strong as you, Enkidu?" Enkidu looked at him like he was surprised by the question. "Of course." "How do you know?" Resicurios had been worrying at his lower lip, feeling wretched, but Enkidu's eyes had softened and his lips had curved. "You're my little brother, aren't you?" Enkidu then picked him up and spun him around, tossed him into the air, and then caught him again. His older brother's smile was as bright as the sun. "You can do anything, Tumra." Resicurios had thrown his arms round his brother's neck and buried his face in his shoulder. He loved the warmth of the sun, but its light had always hurt his eyes. This is the end of the audio sample of Sand to Glass by Remy Apepp. If you'd like to read more, please check out the book on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and hardback forms. As always, all Thinklings Books ebooks have their DRMs unlocked, so you can download and enjoy the book in any format.